The war room aboard the U.S. Liberty buzzed with nervous energy. 12 different alien species had gathered around the massive holographic display, their various forms of communication, creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones. At the center of it all stood Captain Jake Morrison, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of the tactical screen. The battle at Kepler Station had been a disaster. 3/4 of the Coalition fleet lay in ruins, scattered across space like broken toys. The survivors had barely escaped with their lives, and now they faced an even worse reality. The Void Swarm was still coming. The enemy destroyed our defensive line in less than 4 hours, Admiral Kethver said, his tall, crystalline form shimmering with anxiety. The Xanthari had never lost a battle this badly. Their logical minds struggled to process the complete failure of their tactics. Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the battle footage playing on the screen. Ships exploded in silence, their crews vaporized in seconds. The Void Swarm moved like a living thing, flowing around obstacles and striking at weak points with deadly precision. They knew exactly where to hit us, Commander Lisa Brooks said from Morrison's left side. She had been his second-in-command for 5 years, and she had never seen him this quiet during a tactical review. The alien representatives shifted uncomfortably. The Nexari, beings of pure energy contained in crystalline shells, hummed with fear. The small, furry Kepians chittered among themselves in high-pitched voices. Even the massive Gorlick, who stood nearly 8 feet tall, seemed nervous. Morrison had been staring at the same section of footage for 10 minutes. His finger hovered over the control pad, rewinding the same 30 seconds over and over. The other species watched him with growing concern. Humans were known for their unpredictable behavior, but this level of focus was unusual even for them. Captain Morrison, Admiral Kethver said, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones of his species. We need to discuss our next move. The Void Swarm will reach our position in 18 hours. Morrison didn't respond. He continued watching the footage, his expression growing more intense with each replay. The alien representatives exchanged worried glances. They had worked with humans for decades, but they still didn't fully understand them. Dr. Alex Turner, the ship's xenopsychologist, stepped forward. He had spent his career studying the differences between human and alien thinking patterns. Captain, what are you seeing? For a moment, Morrison's eyes flickered toward Turner, then back to the screen. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Those who knew him well recognized the sign. Morrison had discovered something important, something that changed everything. The footage showed the Void Swarm's attack pattern. The enemy ships moved in perfect coordination, striking at the Coalition fleet's weak points with surgical precision. They had bypassed the strongest defensive positions and hit the supply lines first, then the command ships, then the support vessels. It was textbook human naval strategy. Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the control pad. He rewound the footage one more time, focusing on a specific section where the enemy had executed a perfect pincer movement. The tactic had been used by human naval commanders for centuries, dating back to ancient sea battles on Earth. The formation they're using, Morrison said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the Trafalgar pattern. The alien representatives looked confused. Human military history was not their area of expertise. But Dr. Turner's face went pale. He understood the implications immediately. That's impossible, Turner said. The Trafalgar pattern was developed by human naval forces 300 years ago. How would the Void Swarm know about it? Morrison didn't answer. He continued staring at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. The Void Swarm was a hive mind, a collective consciousness that absorbed the knowledge of every species it consumed. But they had never encountered humans before. At least, that's what everyone believed. Commander Brooks watched Morrison with growing concern. She had served under him through 12 major battles, and she had never seen him react this way. Usually, he would analyze the tactical situation quickly and begin formulating countermeasures. But now he stood frozen, as if the weight of some terrible realization had settled on his shoulders. "Captain," she said gently, "what are you thinking?" Morrison's eyes met hers for a brief moment. In that look, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who had just realized that everything he thought he knew was wrong. Without a word, Morrison turned away from the tactical display. He walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent war room. The alien representatives watched him go, their various forms of communication creating a chorus of confusion and concern. "Captain Morrison," Admiral Kethvar called. "After him. We need to make a decision. The fleet is looking to us for leadership." Morrison paused at the doorway, his back still turned to the room. For a long moment, he stood there in silence. Then, without looking back, he spoke in a voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him. "I need some time to think." The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the war room in stunned silence. The alien representatives looked at each other with growing alarm. They had never seen a human commander abandon a tactical meeting in the middle of a crisis. Doctor Turner tried to make sense of what had just happened. Morrison had discovered something in the battle footage, something that had shaken him to his core. The mention of the Trafalgar pattern suggested that the enemy knew human military tactics. But how was that possible? Commander Brooks took charge of the meeting, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept glancing at the door, hoping Morrison would return. The alien representatives began discussing evacuation plans and retreat routes, but their voices seemed distant and unreal. Outside in the corridor, Morrison walked slowly toward his quarters. Crew members stepped aside as he passed, sensing something different about their captain. His usual confident stride had been replaced by the heavy steps of a man carrying an impossible burden. The implications of what he had seen were staggering. If the Void Swarm knew human tactics, it meant they had encountered humans before. And if they had encountered humans, it meant they had absorbed human knowledge, human strategies, human ways of thinking. Morrison reached his quarters and sealed the door behind him. He stood in the center of the room, staring at nothing, his mind racing through the possibilities. The truth was worse than anyone could imagine, and he was the only one who understood it. The silence that followed would last for 12 hours, and when it ended, nothing would ever be the same. Commander Lisa Brooks stood outside Captain Morrison's quarters, her hand hovering over the door chime. She had been there for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to disturb him. It had been 6 hours since he had left the war room, and he hadn't responded to any communication attempts. The ship's AI had confirmed that Morrison was alive and moving around inside his quarters, but he hadn't spoken a single word. The silence was starting to worry everyone aboard the Liberty. Brooks finally pressed the chime. The soft tone echoed through the corridor, but there was no response from inside. She waited 30 seconds and tried again. Still nothing. "Captain Morrison," she called through the door. "Sir, we need to talk about the tactical situation. The other ships are asking for orders." Silence. Brooks sighed and activated her communication device. "Dr. Turner, please report to Deck 7, Section 12. While she waited, Brooks noticed other crew members glancing nervously in her direction. Word had spread quickly through the ship about Morrison's strange behavior. The human crew was used to their captain's occasional moments of deep thought, but this was different. This felt wrong. Dr. Turner arrived within minutes, his expression worried. "Any response?" he asked. "Nothing." Brooks replied, He's been completely silent for 6 hours. Even when Admiral Kethver sent an emergency priority message, he didn't acknowledge it. Turner frowned. As the ship's xenopsychologist, he had studied human behavior patterns extensively. This isn't normal, even for Captain Morrison. He's always been communicative during crisis situations. What do you think is wrong with him? Brooks asked. I'm not sure, Turner admitted. But based on his reaction in the war room, I think he's discovered something that's fundamentally changed his understanding of our situation. Humans sometimes enter a state of deep processing when faced with overwhelming problems. It's like a mental shutdown while the mind tries to work through complex information. Brooks activated the door override code, but the system rejected her command. Morrison had manually locked the door from the inside, something he had never done before. During a mission, Captain, she called again. Sir, I'm using Emergency Protocol 7. You need to respond, or I'll have to force entry. Through the door, they could hear the faint sound of footsteps. Morrison was moving around inside, but he still didn't answer. Turner put his hand on Brooks' shoulder. Let me try something. He sighed. He approached the door and spoke in a calm, professional voice. Captain Morrison, this is Dr. Turner. I'm not asking you to make any decisions or give any orders. I just need to know that you're okay. A simple acknowledgement would be enough. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, they thought he might respond. But the silence stretched on, and finally the footsteps resumed. Brooks' communication device crackled to life. Commander Brooks, this is Admiral Kethver. I need to speak with Captain Morrison immediately. The Coalition fleet is fragmenting. Brooks exchanged a worried glance with Turner. Admiral, the captain is unavailable at the moment. What's the situation? 3 ships have already left the formation. Kethver's voice carried the harmonic stress patterns of his species. Kepian vessels are talking about abandoning the mission entirely. They're saying the humans have lost their will to fight. That's not true, Brooks protested. Captain Morrison is just thinking through our options. Then why won't he communicate with us? Kethver asked. The other human ships are reporting similar behavior from their captains. Whatever Captain Morrison discovered, it's affecting all of your commanders. Turner's eyes widened. All of them? That's impossible unless ... Unless what? Brooks demanded. Unless they've all reached the same conclusion independently, Turner said. If multiple human commanders are all reacting the same way to the same information, it suggests they've all discovered something truly significant. Brooks opened a channel to the other human ships in the fleet. This is Commander Brooks aboard the Liberty. I need to speak with your executive officers immediately. Within minutes, she had confirmed Turner's suspicion. The captains of all 6 human ships had gone silent after reviewing the battle footage. They had all locked themselves in their quarters and refused to communicate with anyone. This is getting out of hand, Brooks said. The aliens are starting to panic. Some of them think we've given up. Turner was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Lisa, I think we need to consider the possibility that our captains have discovered something so disturbing that they're struggling to process it. What could be that bad? Brooks asked. I don't know, Turner admitted. But whatever it is, it's serious enough to cause 6 experienced commanders to shut down simultaneously. On the bridge, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The alien representatives were growing increasingly agitated, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of worry and confusion. The Nexari were humming in discordant tones, the Kepians were chittering frantically, and the Gorlok were making deep, rumbling sounds that indicated extreme stress. Lieutenant Jake Parker, the ship's communications officer, tried to maintain order. Admiral Kethver, I assure you that Captain Morrison is working on a solution. He just needs some time to analyze the situation. Time is what we don't have, Kethva replied. "The Void Swarm will reach our position in 12 hours. We need leadership, not silence." The alien representatives began discussing contingency plans. Some suggested immediate retreat to the nearest safe system. Others proposed splitting the fleet and attempting to outrun the enemy. None of them understood why the humans, who were known for their decisive action in crisis situations, had suddenly become unresponsive in the ship's recreational area. Human crew members gathered in small groups, sharing stories about their captain's past victories. They talked about the Battle of Proxima, where Morrison had defeated a superior force by using an unconventional tactic that no one had expected. They remembered the siege of New Geneva, where he had held off an enemy fleet for 3 days with limited resources. "He always gets quiet before he does something amazing," Petty Officer Mary Johnson said. "Remember the Titan incident? He didn't speak for 2 hours. Then he pulled off that impossible maneuver that saved the entire colony." "This is different," Chief Engineer Bob Wilson replied. "I've never seen him lock himself away like this. Usually he gets quiet on the bridge, but he stays involved in the tactical planning. Maybe he's discovered something about the enemy that changes everything," Ensign Carol Davis suggested. "Something that requires a completely new approach." The crew wanted to believe that Morrison was simply preparing another brilliant tactical surprise. They had faith in their captain's abilities, even when they didn't understand his methods. But as the hours passed, even their confidence began to waver. In the medical bay, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was treating wounded personnel from the battle at Kepler Station. Many of the injured crew members asked about Morrison's condition, sensing that something was wrong. She tried to reassure them, but privately she was as worried as everyone else. "Doctor," one of the wounded Marines said, "is the captain okay?" "The scuttlebutt says he's having some kind of breakdown." "Captain Morrison is fine," Mitchell replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "He's just focusing on finding a solution to our tactical problems." The Marine nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "We're all counting on him. Doc, if he can't figure this out, we're all dead." As the 8th hour of Morrison's silence passed, the situation aboard the Liberty grew more tense. The alien representatives were openly discussing evacuation procedures, and several more ships had left the coalition fleet. The remaining vessels were spread out in a defensive formation, but everyone knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the Void Swarm. Commander Brooks made another attempt to contact Morrison, but the result was the same. The captain remained locked in his quarters, apparently lost in his own thoughts. The weight of command was settling on her shoulders, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Dr. Turner spent his time analyzing the battle footage, trying to understand what Morrison had discovered. The Trafalgar pattern was clearly visible in the enemy's tactics, but the implications were staggering. If the Void Swarm had absorbed human knowledge, it meant they had encountered humans before. And if they had encountered humans, it meant they had absorbed human consciousness. The thought made Turner's blood run cold. The Void Swarm wasn't just a hive mind of alien intelligence. It was a hive mind that included human thinking patterns, human creativity, human strategic knowledge. They weren't just fighting an alien enemy. They were fighting an enemy that fought like them. As the hours dragged on, the silence from Morrison's quarters became more oppressive. The crew began to whisper among themselves, sharing theories about what their captain might be planning. Some believed he was preparing a brilliant tactical surprise. Others feared he had discovered something so terrible that it had broken his spirit. The truth, as they would soon learn, was far worse than any of them could imagine. Dr. Alex Turner sat in his office, surrounded by data files and historical records. He had been working for 8 hours straight, trying to understand what Captain Morrison had discovered. The battle footage played on multiple screens around him, each one showing different angles of the Void Swarm's devastating attack. The more he studied the enemy's tactics, the more disturbed he became. The Trafalgar pattern was just the beginning. As he analyzed the footage frame by frame, he found other familiar strategies buried in the chaos of battle. Computer, cross-reference enemy attack patterns with human naval history database. Turner said. The AI's voice responded immediately. Cross-reference complete. 14 tactical patterns match historical human naval strategies. Probability of coincidence, less than 0.01%. Turner's hands trembled as he pulled up the detailed analysis. The Void Swarm had used the Nelson touch, a tactic developed by Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. They had employed the crossing the T maneuver, perfected by Japanese naval forces in the early 20th century. Most disturbing of all, they had used the Wolfpack strategy, a submarine warfare tactic that had been classified in human military archives for over 2 centuries. How is this possible? Turner whispered to himself. He opened a secure communication channel to the ship's database and began searching through historical records. What he found made his blood run cold. 200 years ago, the human colony. Ship Meridian had disappeared during a deep space exploration mission. The ship had been carrying 15,000 colonists to establish a new settlement in the Outer Rim. Search and rescue operations had found no trace of the vessel or its crew. The official report had listed it as lost with all hands due to unknown causes. Turner's fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed more files. The Meridian had been equipped with the most advanced military database of its time. The ship's AI contained detailed records of human naval history, tactical manuals, and strategic analyses. If the Void Swarm had encountered the Meridian, they would have absorbed all of that knowledge. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what else they would have absorbed. Turner opened another file, this one containing the crew manifest for the Meridian. 15,000 human minds, including military strategists, naval historians, and tactical experts. If the Void Swarm had consumed the ship, they hadn't just gained access to human knowledge. They had gained access to human consciousness itself. The implications were staggering. The Void Swarm wasn't just using human tactics. They were thinking like humans. They had absorbed human creativity, human adaptability, human strategic thinking. They had become something far more dangerous than a simple hive mind. Turner activated his communication device. Commander Brooks, I need to see you immediately. And bring Lieutenant Parker with you. While he waited, Turner continued his analysis. The more he studied the enemy's behavior, the more convinced he became that his theory was correct. The Void Swarm had encountered humans before, and they had absorbed everything that made humans effective warriors. Brooks and Parker arrived within minutes, their faces showing the stress of the past few hours. The coalition fleet was falling apart, and they were struggling to maintain order without Morrison's leadership. What have you found? Brooks asked. Turner gestured to the screens around him. The enemy isn't just using human tactics. They're thinking like humans. Look at this. He showed them the tactical analysis, pointing out the various human strategies that the Void Swarm had employed. Brooks and Parker listened in stunned silence as he explained the implications. You're saying they've encountered humans before? Brooks asked. Not just encountered, Turner replied. Consumed. The colony ship Meridian disappeared 200 years ago in this sector. If the Void Swarm found it, they would have absorbed the entire crew and their knowledge database. Parker's face went pale. 15,000 people? 15,000 human minds, Turner confirmed, including military experts, strategists, and naval historians. The Void Swarm has access to everything they knew. Brooks sat down heavily in a chair. That's why Morrison shut down. He figured this out from the battle footage. And if he figured it out, so did the other human captains, Turner added. They all have access to the same historical databases. They all know about the Meridian. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of their situation. They weren't just fighting an alien enemy. They were fighting an enemy that included human consciousness, human knowledge, human strategic thinking. There's something else, Turner said quietly. Something that makes this even worse. He pulled up another file, this one containing psychological profiles of the Meridian's crew. The ship was carrying some of the most ruthless military minds in human history, people who had been exiled from Earth because their methods were considered too extreme. Brooks looked at the profiles in horror. They were criminals? Not exactly, Turner replied. They were strategists and tacticians who had been deemed too dangerous for conventional military service. The colonial authority thought they could be useful for frontier defense, but they were too ruthless for Earth's civilized society. The implications hit them all at once. The Void Swarm hadn't just absorbed human knowledge. They had absorbed the knowledge of humans who had been selected for their willingness to do anything to win. They had absorbed the consciousness of people who had no moral limitations, no ethical boundaries. Captain Morrison knows this, Brooks said. He knows that we're not just fighting an enemy that thinks like humans. We're fighting an enemy that thinks like the worst of humanity. Turner nodded. And he knows that our conventional tactics won't work against them. How do you fight an enemy that can predict your every move? How do you defeat an enemy that knows your strategies better than you do? Parker was staring at the tactical display with growing horror. The enemy fleet approaching us. They're not just using human tactics. They're using human tactics designed by people who had no conscience. That's right, Turner said. The Void Swarm has access to military strategies that were considered too brutal for human use. They know tactics that we rejected because they were too costly, too ruthless, too inhumane. Brooks stood up and began pacing. We need to tell the crew. They need to know what they're up against. Do we? Turner asked. Will it help them to know that the enemy can think like them? Will it help them to know that they're fighting against absorbed human consciousness? The question hung in the air like a poison cloud. The truth was terrible, but ignorance might be worse. How could they fight an enemy they didn't understand? We need to talk to Morrison, Brooks said finally. He's the only one who can figure out how to fight this thing. They left Turner's office and made their way to Morrison's quarters. The corridor was empty, except for a few crew members who looked at them with desperate hope. Everyone aboard the ship knew that something was wrong, but they didn't know what. Brooks pressed the door chime again. Captain Morrison, this is Commander Brooks. Dr. Turner has confirmed your analysis. We know about the Meridian. We know what we're fighting. For a moment, there was silence. Then they heard footsteps approaching the door. Morrison's voice came through the speaker, but it sounded older, more tired than they had ever heard it. How? Many people know, he asked. Just us, Brooks replied. But the alien representatives are demanding answers. The fleet is falling apart. Another long pause. Then Morrison spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa, what I'm thinking, what we're going to have to do, it's going to change everything. It's going to change us. Sir, we need options, Brooks said. The Void Swarm will be here in 8 hours. We need a plan. The plan is simple, Morrison replied. To fight monsters, we have to become monsters. To defeat an enemy that thinks like the worst of humanity, we have to become the worst of humanity. The words sent a chill down their spines. They all understood what Morrison was saying. To defeat the Void Swarm, they would have to abandon their moral principles. They would have to become as ruthless as the enemy they faced. Captain, Turner said, there might be another way. If we can understand how the absorbed consciousness works, maybe we can find the weakness. I've been thinking about that for 10 hours, Morrison replied. The absorbed consciousness gives them human strategic thinking, but it might also give them human weaknesses. But exploiting those weaknesses, it would require us to do things that we've never done before. Brooks pressed her hand against the door. Sir, whatever it takes, we're with you. Are you? Morrison asked. Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. We'll win, but we'll lose something essential about ourselves in the process. The silence stretched on as they all contemplated the terrible choice before them. They could maintain their humanity and lose the war, or they could sacrifice their humanity and win. There was no middle ground, no compromise solution, in his quarters. Morrison sat in his chair, staring at the tactical display. He had spent 10 hours thinking through every possible option, every potential strategy. The conclusion was always the same. To defeat an enemy that thought like humans, they would have to think like the worst humans who had ever lived. The weight of that realization was crushing. He was about to ask his crew and his allies to abandon. The bridge of the U.S. Liberty was eerily quiet. The normal hum of conversation had been replaced by tense whispers and worried glances. It had been 11 hours since Captain Morrison had locked himself in his quarters, and the crew was starting to lose hope. Commander Brooks stood at the tactical station, trying to coordinate with the remaining ships in the Coalition fleet. Half of the alien vessels had already departed, unable to understand why the humans had suddenly become unresponsive. The ones that remained were growing more agitated by the hour. Commander, Lieutenant Parker called from the communications station. Admiral Kethvor is requesting another update. He's threatening to pull the Xanthari ships out of the formation. Brooks closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Tell him we'll have an answer soon. You've been saying that for 6 hours. Parker replied. I don't think he believes us anymore. The bridge crew exchanged worried looks. They had all served under Morrison for years, and they had never seen him abandon his post during a crisis. Some of them were starting to wonder if their captain had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Ensign Carol Davis looked up from her sensor station. Commander, the Void Swarm is now 3 hours away. They're maintaining formation and heading directly for us. Brooks nodded grimly. 3 hours to figure out how to fight an enemy that could think like humans. 3 hours to come up with a miracle. Then the bridge doors opened and Captain Morrison stepped through. The entire bridge fell silent. Morrison looked older than he had 12 hours ago, as if the weight of his realization had aged him years in a single night. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held a darkness that none of them had ever seen before. He walked slowly to his command chair, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The crew watched him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were glad to see their captain, but something about him was different. Something had changed. Morrison sat down and stared at the main tactical display. The Void Swarm appeared as a massive red cloud on the screen, moving steadily toward their position. The Coalition fleet was spread out in a defensive formation, but everyone knew it wouldn't be enough. Captain, Brooks said carefully, Sir, are you ready to brief the crew? Morrison didn't respond immediately. He continued staring at the tactical display, his expression unreadable. The bridge crew waited, holding their breath. Finally, Morrison spoke. How many ships are left in the Coalition? 18, Brooks replied. 6 human vessels, 12 alien ships. The others departed over the past few hours. Morrison nodded slowly. And the civilian evacuees? 200,000 refugees aboard 37 transport ships, Brooks said. They're positioned behind our defensive line. Morrison was quiet for another long moment. The crew could see him processing information, working through some complex problem in his mind. They had seen him do this before, but never for so long, never with such intensity. Sir, Dr. Turner said, stepping forward, I've confirmed your analysis about the meridian. The crew understands what we're facing. Morrison's eyes flicked too. Turner, then back to the tactical display. Do they? He asked quietly. Do they really understand what it means to fight an enemy that thinks like us? We understand enough, Brooks said. We know this isn't going to be like any battle we've fought before. Morrison stood up from his chair and walked to the main display. He touched the screen, zooming in on the approaching void swarm, the enemy. Fleet was massive, easily 3 times the size of the coalition forces. They're not just using our tactics, Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're using our tactics as they were designed to be used, without restraint, without mercy, without the moral limitations that we impose on ourselves. The bridge crew leaned forward, straining to hear him. Morrison's voice was so quiet that they had to concentrate to make out his words. The people aboard the Meridian weren't just strategists, Morrison continued. They were the strategists that Earth couldn't stomach, the ones who were too ruthless for civilized society, the ones who would do anything to win. Ensign Davis looked confused. Sir, what does that mean for us? Morrison turned to face the crew. His expression was haunted, as if he had seen something terrible in the depths of his own mind. It means that to defeat them, we have to become them. We have to think like them. We have to be willing to do what they're willing to do. And what's that? Brooks asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the faces of his crew. These were good people, decent people who had joined the fleet to protect innocent lives. What he was about to ask them to do would change them forever. We're going to have to sacrifice everything, he said finally. Our principles, our values, our humanity. We're going to have to become the monsters to kill the monsters. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The crew stared at their captain in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just said. They had followed him through dozens of battles, but he had never asked them to abandon their moral principles. Sir, Lieutenant Parker said hesitantly, what exactly are you proposing? Morrison looked at him for a long moment, and at the rest of the crew. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that it was almost a whisper. We're going to use the civilian transports as bait. The bridge erupted in shocked murmurs. Several crew members looked horrified at the suggestion. Using civilian refugees as bait was against every principle they had sworn to uphold. Captain, Brooks said, we can't do that. Those are innocent people. Yes, Morrison replied. 200,000 innocent people. And if we don't use them as bait, they'll die anyway, along with everyone else in this sector. Dr. Turner stepped forward. Captain, surely there's another way. We can't sacrifice civilians. Morrison turned to face the tactical display again. The Void Swarm is expecting us to fight defensively. They're expecting us to protect the civilian ships. They're counting on our humanity. He paused, his hands clenched into fists. But what if we don't act human? What if we act like the absorbed consciousness would act? What if we think like the worst of humanity? The bridge fell silent again. The crew was beginning to understand what Morrison was proposing, and the realization was terrifying. The civilian transports will jump to the enemy's flank, Morrison continued. They'll appear to be fleeing, but they'll actually be carrying our heaviest weapons. When the Void Swarm moves to intercept them, we'll execute a pincer movement from both sides. And the civilians? Brooks asked. Some of them will die, Morrison said bluntly. Maybe a lot of them. But if we don't do this, all of them will die, along with everyone else in this sector. The crew exchanged horrified looks. They had never heard their captain speak so coldly about civilian casualties. This wasn't the Morrison they knew. Sir, Ensign Davis said, this goes against everything we believe in. We protect civilians. We don't use them as weapons. Morrison turned to look at her. Ensign, What do you think the absorbed consciousness would do in this situation? What do you think the strategists from the Meridian would do? Davis was quiet. For a moment. They would use whatever resources they had available. That's right, Morrison said. They would use the civilian transports. They would sacrifice whoever they had to sacrifice. They would do whatever it took to win. He walked back to his command chair and sat down. And that's what we're going to do. Because if we don't, the Void Swarm will consume this entire sector. They'll absorb every mind, every consciousness, every trace of life. And they'll use that knowledge to consume the next sector, and the next, until there's nothing left. The bridge was silent for a long moment. The crew was struggling to process what their captain was asking them to do. They had joined the fleet. To protect people, not to sacrifice them. Commander Brooks stepped closer to Morrison's chair. Captain, I understand the tactical logic, but asking the crew to participate in this, it will destroy morale. It will destroy us. Morrison looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her step back. It was the look of a man who had already made peace with damnation. Lisa, he said quietly, we're already destroyed. The moment I realized what we're fighting, we were already lost. The only question now is whether we lose with dignity or lose with victory. Dr. Turner moved to the front of the bridge. Captain, there has to be another way. Human ingenuity, human creativity. Surely we can find a solution. That doesn't require us to become like them. Morrison shook his head slowly. Alex, I've spent 12 hours thinking about this. I've considered every possible alternative. The absorbed consciousness knows every strategy we might use. They know how we think, how we plan, how we fight. The only way to surprise them is to think like someone we're not. He stood up again and faced the crew. The strategists aboard the Meridian weren't just ruthless. They were brilliant. They understood that sometimes victory requires sacrificing everything you believe in. They understood that sometimes you have to become the enemy to defeat the enemy. Lieutenant Parker spoke up from his station. Sir, what about the alien ships? Will they agree to this plan? Morrison's expression darkened. The alien ships don't need to know the details. They just need to follow orders. The implications of that statement hit the crew like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't just asking. T.H. The bridge of the U.E.'s Liberty had never been so quiet. For 5 long minutes, nobody spoke. The crew stood at their stations, staring at Captain Morrison, as if seeing him for the first time. The man they had followed for years had just asked them to abandon everything they believed in. Commander Brooks was the first to break the silence. Captain, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Morrison looked at her with tired eyes. Go ahead. Do you believe this is the right thing to do? She asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. It's the worst thing we could possibly do, but it's also the only thing that will work. Brooks nodded slowly. She had served under Morrison long enough to understand the distinction. Sometimes being a leader meant making choices that were morally wrong, but tactically necessary. Sir, Lieutenant Parker said from his station, the other human ships are requesting orders. Their captains have been in communication with each other. They've all reached the same conclusion you have. Morrison activated his communication system. This is Captain Morrison to all human vessels. We're implementing Plan Omega. All captains acknowledge. One by one, the responses came in. Each human captain confirmed their understanding of the plan. They had all spent the past 12 hours wrestling with the same terrible realization, and they had all arrived at the same impossible solution. Dr. Turner stepped forward. Captain, before we proceed, I need to make sure the crew understands the psychological implications of what we're about to do. This will change us permanently. There's no going back to who we were before. Morrison nodded. I know. But the alternative is extinction. Not just for us, but for every sentient being in this sector of the galaxy. He turned to address the entire bridge crew. I'm not ordering anyone to participate in this. If you can't live with what we're about to do, you can transfer to one of the alien ships. I won't think less of you for making that choice. The crew exchanged glances, but nobody moved. They were scared, horrified by what Morrison was proposing, but they were also loyal. They had followed him this far, and they would follow him to the end. Ensign Davis spoke up. Sir, what do we tell the civilian transport crews? They need to know what they're getting into. Morrison's expression hardened. We tell them they're participating in a tactical maneuver designed to outflank the enemy. We don't tell them they're bait. That's lying to them, Davis protested. Yes, Morrison replied, it is. And if we told them the truth, they would refuse to participate, and everyone would die. Sometimes lying is the lesser evil. The tactical display showed the void swarm, continuing its approach. 1 hour until contact. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kethvar aboard the lead Zenthari vessel. Admiral, this is Captain Morrison. I'm ready to brief you on our battle plan. Kethvar's crystalline form appeared on the main screen, his harmonic voice carrying obvious relief. Captain Morrison, we were beginning to fear that the humans had abandoned the coalition. We would never abandon our allies, Morrison replied. We've been developing a strategy to exploit the enemy's tactical patterns. We believe we can achieve victory, but it will require precise coordination. Morrison outlined the plan carefully, omitting the details about using civilian transports as bait. He presented it as a complex flanking maneuver designed to exploit weaknesses in the enemy formation. The alien representatives listened intently, their various forms of communication indicating growing optimism. This plan is highly aggressive, Admiral Kethvar observed. Are you certain it will work? Nothing is certain in war, Morrison replied, but this is our best chance for victory. What Morrison didn't tell them was that the plan would work because it was designed by someone who thought like the enemy, someone who had abandoned human moral constraints and embraced the ruthless calculation of the absorbed consciousness. Commander Brooks coordinated with the civilian transport commanders, explaining their role in the tactical maneuver. The transport captains were nervous but willing to help. They trusted the military to protect them, unaware that they were being sacrificed for the greater good. Transport Group Alpha, you'll jump to coordinates 774 and begin evasive maneuvers, Brooks explained. The enemy will move to intercept you, but our combat vessels will be in position to support you. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The combat vessels would be in position, but their primary objective wasn't to protect the transports. It was to use the transport's destruction as a tactical advantage. Dr. Turner monitored the crew's psychological state as they prepared for battle. He could see the strain on their faces, the weight of what they were about to do. Good people were preparing to do terrible things, and it was tearing them apart inside. Captain, Turner said privately, I'm concerned about the crew's mental state after this battle. Assuming we survive, they're going to need extensive psychological support. Morrison nodded. I know. But right now, the only thing that matters is making sure there is an after this battle. The alien ships moved into position, their crews unaware of the true nature of the plan. The Zenthari vessels took up defensive positions, while the smaller alien ships prepared for hit-and-run attacks. They believed they were fighting a conventional battle. 30 minutes until contact. Morrison stood at the center of the bridge, watching the tactical display with the focused intensity of a predator. He had become something new, something harder, and more ruthless than the man his crew had known. All ships report ready, Lieutenant Parker announced. Morrison nodded. Begin the operation. The civilian transports jumped to their assigned coordinates, appearing on the enemy's flank exactly as planned. The Void Swarm immediately detected them and began moving to intercept, just as Morrison had predicted. Enemies taking the bait. Ensign Davis reported. Morrison watched the enemy formation change, saw them commit ships to pursue the transports. The absorbed consciousness was thinking like humans, protecting what appeared to be fleeing civilians. They couldn't understand that humans might use their own people as weapons. Phase 2, Morrison ordered. The human combat vessels emerged from Vaughn, hiding and began their attack on the enemy's weakened main formation. Simultaneously, the alien ships attacked from the opposite direction, creating the pincer movement that Morrison had planned. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The Void Swarm fought with deadly efficiency, using human tactics combined with alien technology. But Morrison's plan was working. The enemy was caught between multiple attack vectors, unable to coordinate their defense effectively. Transport Group Alpha is under heavy fire, Parker reported. They're requesting immediate support. Morrison stared at the tactical display, watching as the civilian transports came under attack. Ships carrying thousands of innocent people were being destroyed, and he was doing nothing to help them. "Sir," Brooks said quietly, "we could send a squadron to assist them." "No," Morrison replied. "Let them draw more enemy ships. The longer the Void Swarm focuses on the transports, the more damage we can do to their main fleet." Brooks felt sick to her stomach, but she followed orders. Around the bridge, the crew watched in horror as civilian ships exploded on their screens. They were winning the battle, but the cost was devastating. The Void Swarm began to realize they had been tricked. The absorbed consciousness understood, too late, that they had underestimated human ruthlessness. They tried to redirect their forces, but Morrison had anticipated this as well. Phase 3, he ordered. The final phase of the attack commenced. Human and alien ships converged on the enemy formation from all sides, overwhelming their defenses. The Void Swarm fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. 2 hours later, it was over. The Void Swarm fleet was destroyed, their ships scattered across space like broken fragments. The coalition had achieved victory, but the cost had been enormous. "Casualty report," Morrison ordered. Lieutenant Parker's voice was shaky as he read. The numbers: 14 civilian transports destroyed. Estimated 43,000 civilian casualties. Military losses are significantly lighter. The bridge fell silent. 43,000 innocent people had died because Morrison had used them as bait. The crew stared at their captain, seeing him clearly for the first time. He had become exactly what he said he would become: a monster. Morrison walked to his command chair and sat down heavily. The weight of what he had done was settling on his shoulders like a crushing burden. He had saved the sector, possibly the galaxy, but he had done it by sacrificing everything he believed in. Commander Brooks approached him slowly. "Captain, the alien fleet commanders are requesting a debrief. They want to understand how we achieved victory." Morrison looked up at her with empty eyes. "Tell them we got lucky." "Sir," Brooks said quietly, "what do we do now?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Now we live with what we've done. We live with the knowledge that we saved billions of lives by sacrificing thousands. We live with the knowledge that we became the very thing we spent our lives fighting against." Dr. Turner stepped forward. "Captain, for what it's worth, you made the right choice. You did what had to be done." Morrison shook his head. "No, Alex, I made the necessary choice." "There's a difference." He stood up and walked toward the exit.